Europe in the year 1346 was a continent on the rise. Trade routes connected distant kingdoms. Cities were growing larger than ever before. Merchants crossed continents carrying spices, silk, and precious metals. Few people knew that one of the deadliest disasters in human history was already moving toward them. The medieval world was more connected than many imagine. Goods traveled thousands of miles from China to Europe. Along these trade routes moved merchants, travelers, soldiers, and unseen passengers that would soon change history. The vast Mongol Empire linked enormous regions of Eurasia. Trade flourished under Mongol protection. But increased movement also created pathways for disease. What helped commerce thrive would also help a deadly plague spread across continents. The disease responsible for the Black Death was caused by a bacterium now known as Yersinia pestis. It often spread through fleas that lived on rodents. For centuries, the bacteria survived in animal populations, waiting for the right conditions to spread. Most historians believe the plague originated somewhere in Central Asia. Though the exact location remains debated, evidence suggests the disease was already spreading through trade networks long before Europe became aware of it. In 1346, a siege at the trading port of Kaffa may have helped spread the plague westward. According to historical accounts, disease devastated the besieging army. Merchants fleeing the city carried more than cargo aboard their ships. They carried the beginning of a catastrophe. In 1347, the plague reached Europe through the ports of Sicily. Merchant ships arrived from the Black Sea, but many of their crews were already dead or dying. What seemed like isolated sickness would soon reveal itself as something far more devastating. At first, the illness seemed manageable, but within days, entire families began to die. Doctors had no explanation. The speed of the disease defied everything they understood about medicine. From Sicily, the plague spread rapidly across Italy. Trade routes acted like arteries, carrying death from city to city. Within months, no region felt safe. Doctors attempted to fight the unknown disease using herbal remedies, bloodletting, and crude masks filled with herbs. But none of it worked. The plague continued to spread unchecked. By 1348, the plague had reached France. Paris, one of Europe's largest cities, was overwhelmed. Streets filled with the dead, and there was nowhere left to hide. The most terrifying aspect of the Black Death was not just its brutality, but its speed. People could go from healthy to dead in less than a week. Entire households vanished within days. As the plague spread, entire neighborhoods fell silent. Markets closed. Businesses stopped operating. Streets once filled with merchants and travelers became eerily empty. In some cities, so many people died that daily life simply ceased to function. Churchyards quickly ran out of space. Authorities were forced to dig enormous mass graves. The dead arrived faster than they could be buried. Traditional funeral rituals disappeared as survival became the priority. No one understood what was causing the plague. Some blamed contaminated air. Others believed it was caused by planetary alignments, earthquakes, or supernatural forces. In a world without modern science, fear often filled the gaps left by knowledge. For many people, the plague seemed like divine punishment. Churches filled with desperate believers seeking protection. Across Europe, people prayed for mercy, hoping the catastrophe would somehow pass them by. Some groups believed the plague was punishment for humanity's sins. Known as flagellants, they traveled from town to town performing public acts of penance. They hoped that suffering would convince God to end the disaster. As death tolls rose, society itself began to weaken. Farms were abandoned, harvests failed, trade slowed dramatically. Across Europe, communities struggled to maintain order as fear spread faster than information. The illness often began suddenly. Victims developed fever, chills, headaches, and extreme weakness. At first, it seemed like many other diseases, but soon, unmistakable signs began to appear. Painful swellings known as buboes formed beneath the skin, often near the neck, armpits, or groin. These swollen lymph nodes became one of the disease's most recognizable symptoms, giving rise to the term bubonic plague. For many victims, the disease progressed with terrifying speed. Some died within only a few days, others survived slightly longer, but few recovered. Entire families could be wiped out before neighboring communities even understood what was happening. As authorities searched for solutions, some cities began experimenting with isolation measures. Ships arriving from infected regions were forced to wait offshore before passengers could disembark. These early quarantines became some of history's first organized public health responses. Between 1348 and 1351, the Black Death reached its peak. Entire regions lost enormous portions of their populations. Historians estimate that tens of millions of people died across Europe, Asia, and North Africa. By the early 1350s, the Black Death had transformed entire societies. Villages disappeared, cities shrank, countless traditions were interrupted. Europe would never be quite the same again. By the early 1350s, the worst of the Black Death began to subside. No one fully understood why. The disease did not disappear completely, but the first catastrophic wave slowly lost momentum. For the survivors, a new challenge was beginning: rebuilding. Across Europe, countless villages stood nearly empty. Some disappeared entirely from history. Generations of families vanished, leaving behind homes, farms, and churches that would never be used again. With millions dead, Europe faced a severe labor shortage. Landowners desperately needed workers to farm fields, repair buildings, and maintain local economies. For the first time in generations, ordinary laborers gained new bargaining power. The Black Death weakened long-standing social structures. In many regions, feudal systems that had dominated medieval life for centuries began to crack. Labor became more valuable, and workers increasingly demanded better conditions. For many survivors, opportunities expanded. Wages rose. Skilled workers became more valuable. Although recovery was slow and uneven, the economic balance between wealthy landowners and common laborers began to shift. Historians continued to debate the full impact of the Black Death, but many agree that the pandemic accelerated major social and economic changes. The world that emerged afterward would be fundamentally different from the one that existed before. The Black Death did not vanish after its first wave. Over the following centuries, plague outbreaks returned again and again. Although rarely as devastating as the original catastrophe, the disease continued to haunt communities across Europe. The plague exposed the limits of medieval medicine. In the centuries that followed, physicians increasingly emphasized observation, evidence, and experimentation. The search for answers helped lay foundations for future medical progress. Centuries later, scientists finally identified the culprit. A bacterium known as Yersinia pestis was responsible for the Black Death. What had once seemed like a supernatural mystery could now be explained through biology. The Black Death demonstrated how interconnected societies can accelerate the spread of disease. It also highlighted the importance of public health measures, quarantine systems, and scientific understanding, lessons that remain relevant today. The true human cost of the Black Death can never be fully measured. Historians estimate that between 1/3 and 1/2 of Europe's population may have died. Tens of millions of lives were lost across continents in one of history's deadliest pandemics. The Black Death was more than a pandemic. It was a turning point in human history. It reshaped economies, transformed societies, challenged beliefs, and changed the course of entire civilizations. The plague's victims are long gone, but its impact continues to echo through the modern world. Understanding the Black Death is not simply about studying the past. It is about understanding how humanity responds when faced with its greatest challenges.